And joining me now is my friend. He's an independent journalist, a journalist extraordinaire, if you will. He's also the author of the New York Times bestselling book Unmasked, all about Antifa. He's one of the only journalists, by the way, who actually covers Antifa in American cities. Andy No. Andy, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you, Liz.
Okay, so I have so many questions to ask you because you are one of the only investigative journalists who's interested in covering the reality of what Antifa is. Once in a while, Antifa will make a headline for some outrageous behavior that they engage in, but you're one of the only ones who has investigated the ideology and the organizational structure of this. So first of all, could you talk about what's happening still in Portland? Because Antifa is still acting as the anarchists that they are, yet this isn't making headlines anymore. What's been happening up there?
Yeah, so we're in August of 2021 now, more than a year since rioting began after George Floyd died, and the violence is still ongoing in Portland. It doesn't get much media attention, if any at all, because, well, it can no longer be used as a bludgeon against a Trump administration. People don't have Trump to blame anymore, so they turn their attention elsewhere. But as I've said before in my reporting, the fascists that Antifa opposes is they label anybody a fascist who they're against. So it's often most often applied inaccurately to people who are regular conservatives, Trump supporters, or patriotic Americans, and it's taken a really disturbing turn in recent months in that Antifa in Portland has explicitly turned their attention toward conservative or traditionalist Christians. It started with after the election last year, they've been attacking churches, actually breaking out windows. So, you know, in the context of war, these can be considered war crimes because they're explicitly targeting protected spaces, but nothing is sacred to them. And by the way, I'm not a religious person myself, but in warfare, there's a reason why people don't attack houses of worship. You recognize, even if you don't follow that particular religion, that this is a space that is sacred to the people there. But Antifa have no regard for anything that is sacred or valuable, so they have smashed up churches of all denominations, Catholic as well as Protestant churches. And this past weekend, they turned their violence towards actual worshipers, families. Last Saturday, there was a family worship event in a park in downtown Portland, and Antifa came. And in really disturbing video, you can see them inch closer and closer to these several dozen people. It was a very small gathering. And Antifa eventually then started tearing apart the sound system and then dumped it into the river. And then they hurled firework explosives, terrorized the children and women who were there. You can see people scatter and running around screaming, and Antifa sprayed people with bear mace and other chemical irritants. In response to that violence, there was a Christian worship band leader named Sean Foist, who the following day went to that same location and held a very large Christian worship concert. There were thousands of people. And I think, at least in my living memory, I don't think there's been any evangelical Christian event as large as what happened on Sunday. I mean, Antifa were outnumbered so much that they didn't do anything, but they kept eye on the worshipers, recording videos, taking pictures of who were there. And then, as we've seen them do in the past, what they wait for is they target people as they are dispersing events when they split off. So we saw that in DC last year at some of these pro-Trump rallies. They would go after people once they're in smaller numbers. So in downtown, the violence that broke out occurred between Antifa and the volunteer security that acted to protect the people. So you saw just rolling battles going on for more than an hour. Police didn't intervene. They didn't intervene that night. They did intervene the day before when the Christian families were attacked. So Portland, as it was last year, the same problems are still there in that law enforcement.
It's anarchy, essentially.
Yeah, anarcho-tyranny, right? So you
Well,
have,
here's
yeah,
two questions for you. Let me ask you two questions. So, first of all, let's talk about the police aspect of this. Now, the mayor of Portland, Ted Wheeler, used to excuse Antifa. It got to a point where he claimed that he was not going to let Antifa run rampant over his city. That seems to be empty words because they're still running rampant. Why are police not intervening? Because the duty of police officers is, of course, to stop crimes when they're being committed if they're called, or to pursue crimes or pursue criminals, suspects, who are alleged to have committed crimes. Why are they not intervening when they know what Antifa is doing or has just directly done?
so we know that police are aware of Antifa's plans for violence because Antifa announced their, what they call them, direct actions through flyers on social media weeks ahead of time. And police do monitor these Antifa accounts. They brought attention to it before, but they don't respond. And this is from what I heard from my sourcing, is that as before, well, they just don't have the resources and they don't have the political support. So if you can imagine, any time that police involved in arresting or using crowd control on Antifa, all the cameras come out. It's recorded only in one direction. It leads to lawsuits. It leads to individual officers being pulled from duty and placed under investigation, potentially charged. So, they're just thinking, well, we have other incidents and calls to respond to in the city because police were defunded. So the numbers are really small now. They prioritize other cases.
Is the decision for police not to respond made by the police itself because they know what risks it poses to their officers, or they know that they don't have the resource? Or is the decision for police not to respond to Antifa violence from the politicians who are, the police commissioners, for example, who are in charge of the police forces?
I think it's to the police leadership now. They are supposed to operate autonomously from the politicians, but if you talk to any officer off record, they'll tell you that a police department can't function successfully without the support of city council and whatnot. And when you have part of the city council calling for police to be abolished and essentially espousing the same talking points as Antifa extremists, and well, there's no what reason would they have to respond? And I wish that type of political calculation didn't result in tax-paying citizens, Americans, being brutalized and victimized on the streets without any help. I mean, I've been the victim multiple times, as recently at the end of May. Nobody was arrested for that assault or the assault in 2019. Certainly the people who were assaulted over this past weekend, you're not going to see anything happen. There's just, Portland's also experiencing skyrocketing homicides and murders. So in terms of the priority of what police and detectives are going to investigate, assault and death threats and harassment, intimidation is way down there.
So it's the political support, but I also have to imagine that it's the physical, the material resources that are given to police as well. It's not just a matter of if a police officer responds to Antifa, they won't have the rhetorical support, the backing of the politicians. It's also the material support that the politicians could give to police that they're not giving. And I think this is really important, actually, when we have this conversation, the few of us who are willing to have this conversation, to recognize why Antifa is running rampant, because we are a nation of law and order. We should not be having anarchist mobs that are ruling essentially large cities in the United States, yet that's what's happening in the Pacific Northwest. And Andy, here's my other question. So we have had groups of thugs, for lack of a better word, pop up around our country throughout our history, right? Even in our recent history, the last decade, we had groups like Occupy Wall Street, we had groups like Black Lives Matter, we've had groups like Antifa. And they are separate groups. They might share some of the same Marxist ideology in their agenda, but they are separate groups. And when I saw that particular video that you referenced, and I played it on my show this week, of Antifa attacking this prayer group in Portland, what I was struck by, besides, of course, the poor woman in the background, the young mother who was fearful for her baby's safety. I mean, if that doesn't just rip your heart out, I don't know what will. But what struck me was that these Antifa thugs were not just dressed in black clothes that they pulled out of their parents' basement, right? They weren't just dressed in cargo shorts that they have since high school, a black t-shirt and a black ski mask. These were people in militarized outfits. And that kind of military gear, that was all uniform, by the way, costs money. which means that they have some sort of backing, or one would assume they have some sort of financial backing. What is the root of this group? Who are the financial supporters? Because I can't imagine that very many of these thugs have such high-paying jobs that they can outfit a whole squad of Antifa thugs like military action figures.
Yeah, so I was trying to find the answers to that question. I was working on my book Unmasked because there was money coming in. You could see it in that the militants in Portland and other cities were being armed with essentially the same type of gear, and it looked like it came from the same sources. So like the same shields, the same body armor, the same batons. Some of them would also bring rifles and handguns and knives and homemade explosives like Molotov cocktails as well. That takes not just organization, time, determination, there's money involved as well. So what I've been able to see, because it's actually done you can do it through open source information, Antifa get their money through GoFundMe campaigns, and they always, they never say, the campaign name is never money for Antifa rioting. It'll sound very innocuous. It'll be Portland protest group, something like, you look at that, you would, if you GoFundMe, you would never think that these are violating the policies, which they are. So there's GoFundMe. They also funnel money through PayPal, Cash App, and Venmo. So, we saw recently that the ADL was partnering with with PayPal to try to see to inform PayPal how to better root out funding, organizing done by right-wing or far-right groups and individuals. What's disappointing about that is that there is seemingly in that partnership no provision in informing PayPal about how far-left groups use them, and Cash App and Venmo as well. So yeah, they do this organizing and fundraising directly in the open. And then there are also nonprofit groups who abuse their charity status, by the way. They'll support a project that, again, will sound very innocuous, like some type of jail support group or legal defense group. And then they get lots of donations there. Usually on those, the amounts will even be bigger, and we don't know who these donors are because that information is not made public. So my disappointment with the last administration, and certainly with the current administration, is that the DOJ really, if they are serious about cracking down and finding sort of the ways that militant extremist groups, either on the left or right, carry out their violence, you should look at the funding. They have, they give a lot of rhetoric on the dangers of far-right extremism, but when it comes to far-left extremism that was done night after night after night, that resulted in people dying and being killed, there would be sometimes arrests of individuals, but no systematic effort to really map out where these individuals come from, what other people they're connected to, what groups they're a part of, and what networks they're a part of.
That leads me to my next question. So a strategy on the right, which has been very effective among conservatives when we are identifying various radical left-wing groups, whether it was the Women's March, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's, critical race theory adherents, is to identify who the thought leaders of the movements are and make those thought leaders known figures and expose the beliefs of those thought leaders, right? With the Women's March, it was Linda Sarsour. Her beliefs were so toxic, it toppled the Women's March. With Black Lives Matter, it's Alicia Garza, it's Patrisse Cullors, it's Opal Tometi, and their beliefs are so toxic, it has fundamentally damaged Black Lives Matter. I can go on and on with critical race theory. It's Kimberly Crenshaw who admits that they're critical theorists, which is Marxists, that just do race. What about Antifa? Who are the thought leaders behind Antifa? Because that is one group that has a lot of adherents, a lot of followers. They create a lot of trouble. They commit a heinous amount of violence. Who are the thought leaders behind this group? Who are the leaders?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up that thought and the reasoning behind it, because a lot of times when I'm interviewed, there's not really a lot of interest in terms of the theories and hypotheses and ideology that motivates these people to express support for such violent extremism. I think with BLM, yes, the three co-founders that you just named, they've been exposed for their communist, revolutionary communist anti-American beliefs, but I don't think they've been damaged to the point of where the organization is at any risk. Certainly, they've already gotten the tens and tens of millions of dollars in donations. So, they can withstand a lot now going forward anyways. But so with Antifa, I think what makes them a movement that much more harder to break apart is that there are really there's no single or small group of people who you would call leaders. The ideologies that is espoused is shared through their literature. So their pamphlets, their books, their texts, and they give these out to their comrades at all their events. And, they don't just riot. They have things like book fairs. They have things like...
Who writes their literature? What are they reading?
They're all anonymous. See, that's the thing. So you pick these things up, and it'll introduce you to anarchist communist ideas. It'll introduce you to why the American state is a fascist imperialist state and it needs to be exposed. A lot of the ideas fundamentally come from Marcuse and other Marxist intellectuals from the last century who were part of academia. But they distill those ideas in a way that's easier for... You don't have to be particularly educated to read these things and get an understanding for, the basis for why they smash windows and break into businesses and destroy. It's because capitalism is wicked and tied to white supremacy and racism. So that's why we go after the businesses. So I think because of that decentralized, non-hierarchical structure of Antifa groups, it makes it very, very hard to fundamentally challenge or even topple or even you can't even really arrest leaders or anything because it's done anonymously and done you can think of it like an army of ants essentially. It's not like they're each doing their little role and taking a bite out little by little. And so from one individual, one rioter here and there, you don't kind of recognize how their whole networks and groups, how destructive they actually are when you give them time to work. And unfortunately, they've been given the time to work, to recruit, and to organize. Things have calmed down across much of America. Even in Portland, the rioting's not every night anymore. But just wait. The next time we have another George Floyd video that comes out, all these, the machine will start running again, and you will see the same things that we saw in 2020.
Well, I think that's why your book is so important as well. Not to make it sound like a shameless plug, because we actually didn't even plan this interview as a plug for your book, but you actually do investigate the ideology of this group to try to, as the title would suggest, unmask what their motivation is, what drives them, and what they justify, the violence that they justify in order to try to force their political agenda on people. Andy, it's fascinating talking to you, and as always, big supporter of your journalism on the ground. Thanks for joining me today. It was great.
My pleasure. Thank you, Liz.